Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. So I've reviewed quite a few mini PCs on this channel over the past several months. As much as I love this small form factor, there always seems to be some sort of compromise with any of these PCs. And so it's really hard to find a balance between a good price as well as nice performance. And I gotta say, this new one from MinisForum called the TH50, for all intents and purposes, seems to be that one mini PC that I've been looking for all this time. In fact, this is the only mini PC I've reviewed so far that actually deserves a permanent place on my desk. And for under $600, that really wasn't a statement that I was expecting to say. I've had the device for a few weeks now, and let's take a quick look at some of those specs. So it runs an 11th generation Intel Core i5 processor with 4 cores and 8 threads. It has onboard Iris Xe graphics, as well as 16 gigs of LPDDR4 RAM. Of note, the RAM is soldered onto the board, so there is no upgrade available. In terms of storage, it has an M.2 slot and can ship with up to 512 gigs. It also has 2 slots for SATA hard drives, Wi-Fi 6, and Bluetooth 5.2. In terms of display and I/O, it has HDMI with 4K 60Hz, as well as DisplayPort and Thunderbolt 4, both giving 8K with 60Hz. On top of that, it has a good amount of ports. It has 2 2.5 gigabit Ethernet, 2 USB 2.0, as well as 4 USB 3.1. Now in terms of price, one of the things I really appreciate, it comes with a bare bones option at $529. But honestly, the price difference between the fully spec'd one and the one without a hard drive is negligible. It's about $70 different. And in addition to getting a hard drive for that $70, it also comes with a Windows 10 Pro license. And so in terms of bang for your buck, the $599 option is actually a better deal. But regardless, the price point of this device here makes it more competitive than any other high-spec mini PC that I've tested before. And so in this video, I'm going to show you all the things that this can do, both in terms of PC gaming and emulation, and I'll also throw in a little bit of Linux performance as well. And finally, we'll take a look at the competition and see why it is the TH50 is my new favorite mini PC. So, without any further delay, let's jump into it. Okay, so breaking things down here, the instruction manual that comes with the device is actually fairly helpful. In addition to labeling all of the I/O and the device components, they also provide instructions on how to get started and install the hard drives, as well as how to mount it on a monitor. These are surprisingly rare things in a lot of these PC manuals. Before we talk about the PC, let's look at what's inside the box. So it comes with a 65-watt AC adapter, and I appreciate here that it's not just some brick that you plug into a power strip. This little extension cord here is going to be easily replaceable and will extend the length of your power cable too. Okay, also in the box you have your hard drive components here. One of these holds the hard drives in place, and then you have your SATA connections. It also comes with an HDMI cable, the VESA mount, and some hard drive screws. Okay, first impressions of the PC itself, it's quite heavy. It's about 2 pounds or 915 grams after you install 2 hard drives. On the front we have a power button, a mic and headphone jacks, 2 USB 3.1s, and then Thunderbolt 4 on the right. On each side there is a huge exhaust vent, and then on the back we have 2 USB 2.0, 2 more USB 3.1, dual 2.5 gigabit LAN, then both DisplayPort, HDMI, and then USB-C for the power adapter, and then a Kensington plug that nobody uses. Not a lot on the bottom, just some mounting brackets for a VESA mount. But yeah, overall it's a sturdy design. The top and bottom are made out of plastic, while the sides are made out of aluminum. Now the top here is actually the fan intake. As you can see, there's a very large fan inside here surrounded by a large heatsink. Overall, I like the design. It's nice and clean. Let's do a quick size comparison. So it looks like this is about 2 1/4 sticks of Kerrygold Irish butter. So I would say the size is placed squarely in the mid-size mini PC range. It's just a tiny bit smaller than an Xbox controller. Now let's take a look under the hood and see what we have to work with. Now there's just 4 screws at the bottom here and then some clips that you have to undo, and this is what it looks like inside. First thing I want to do is get a look at that M.2 slot and see what kind of hard drive we're working with. And so yeah, it's a Kensington hard drive, so I appreciate that they're using a brand name component like this. Additionally, they have a user replaceable M.2 slot for your Bluetooth and Wi-Fi adapter. More on that in a bit. And then everything else on the other side is completely covered by this huge heatsink. And unfortunately, the RAM is covered as well, so I'm not able to take a look. But all the same, this is a very impressive cooling solution here. Like, I have no issues with thermals, and this is why. Now, to install a hard drive, it's super easy. It just attaches to the back case here, and then you add the provided SATA connections, and then they have this little mounting bracket here that you just screw into place. And like I mentioned, there's space for 2 SATA hard drives here. After that, you just plug it in and it's good to go. So full disclosure, I ended up putting a 1TB solid state drive as well as a 2TB hard drive in this as well. The solid state drive I'm going to use primarily for Batocera, whereas the hard drive I'm going to use for storage and ROM management. And so this is what it looks like on the desk. And you may have seen this in the past few videos because I've had this thing on my desk for a while now. It has a small blue light, and other than that, there's not much to it. We'll talk about fan noise and stuff like that once I put it under a heavier load, but for now, let's boot it up and see what everything looks like. Okay, so jumping in here, first thing is just verifying that all the components are correct. Yes, this is the processor we mentioned before, and it does indeed come with Windows 10 Pro. Now look at the processor itself. It's a fairly new Tiger Lake model. It launched in the second quarter of last year, and the recommended price is over $300. And it has a max TDP of 35 watts, and it's already been tuned to that by MinisForum. So thankfully, there's no need to mess with anything within the BIOS. This has already been pushed to the max. So yeah, it's a pretty hefty CPU, and it's impressive they got this into a machine for under $600. The chip is often used in laptops that go for $700 or $800 themselves. Okay, let's take a look at that M.2 Wi-Fi and Bluetooth chip. Now surprisingly, this is the same Wi-Fi chip that is in the Aya Neo devices, and it works really well. It has Wi-Fi 6E. And so because of that, I decided to actually do a Wi-Fi test on this just to see what kind of numbers we can get. Now here in Hawaii, the internet's not the best, but the numbers here are not that bad. 140 for download speeds, and then about 18.5 megabits on the upload side. Now those are our Wi-Fi specs. Let's plug in the Ethernet and see if there's any sort of difference here. And obviously Ethernet's always going to be faster, but honestly it's not that much faster. I'm getting about 210 megabits download and then 20 megabits upload. So between these two different speeds, I would say that Ethernet is not completely necessary. The Wi-Fi itself is nice and stable and fast. Okay, so now let's take a look at the thermals. We're looking at about 35 to 40 degrees Celsius when we're at idle, and the power draw seems to be somewhere around 8 watts when it's not working too hard. And as I mentioned, the TDP is set for 35 watts. So I'm going to run a torture test real quick for a few minutes, and we'll see how the thermals look here. And as you can see here, it's capping out at around 70 to 75 degrees Celsius under 100% load on the CPU. It seemed to spike at the low 80s, but all the same, it seemed to stabilize in the low 70s itself. So overall, I would say the thermals on this are really impressive. And additionally, thanks to that larger fan, the fan noise itself is not very offensive. In fact, it sounds more like a regular desktop PC than the high-end pitch that you usually get with these mini PCs. Let's take a listen here. So yeah, overall, the fan noise on this is the best I've ever seen on a mini PC. Now, in addition to going into all the gaming stuff, I do want to look at this as just a regular old PC. And so while I usually test in 1080p, I'm going to go and I'm going to change it to 4K here and then do some video playback. And my standard test here is to go into YouTube, turn on the stats for nerds, and then run it at 4K 60 Hz and see how many drop frames we get. And you can see it up here in the second line on the top left, and it dropped 1 frame when I first started, which is really impressive. And then across the rest of the video, I think it only dropped 1 other frame that whole time. So 2 drop frames among thousands is really impressive. This is going to be an excellent PC when it comes to video playback as well as using it for a streaming media server. And I don't typically test this, but I thought this is the one mini PC that actually might be capable of doing some good video editing. So I installed DaVinci Resolve, I grabbed one of my more recent video clips here, and then I just kind of went through and cut it up and moved all the components around and then added some text and filters and other things like that. I don't typically use DaVinci Resolve for my own video editing, but I am familiar with it, and it is one that does require a pretty hefty PC to work it properly. And I gotta say, this TH50 just cut through it with no problem. Like, it actually did a really great job. And so I took this clip that was about 1.5 hours altogether, and I crunched it down to about 5 minutes. And then I added some transitions and effects as well as some text overlays. Now this is 1080p 60Hz footage here. I don't film in 4K, so I don't have that to test with. But all the same, I want to see how long it takes to render a 5-minute clip. And so running through the delivery options here in DaVinci Resolve, it took about 4.5 minutes altogether to render a 5-minute clip. For me, anything under a 1-to-1 runtime is pretty great for video editing. And so altogether, I would say if you want to do some light video work, this mini PC is more than adequate. And if it can handle this level of video editing, then it's going to do just fine for photo editing too. And of course, everyday computing tasks, things like spreadsheets and shopping and things like that, it's going to be excellent as well. So overall, in terms of balanced PC with having some heft to it, this is the best one I've tested so far. But of course, the channel is called Retro Game Core, not Retro Video Editing Core. So let's get into the gaming part. As always, we'll start off really slow. We'll start off with some 2D games, and as I mentioned before, I'm going to run everything at 1080p, and I'll push it to the max settings that are available within each game. So when it comes to these lower spec games, no problem here. Now, Ori and the Will of the Wisp was surprising to me. I was actually able to get 60 frames per second under high settings. And this is the first mini PC I've been able to do that. Most of them have to run at the low settings in order to get 60 frames. And some of the lighter weight games can run at 4K no problem. Here's Castle Crashers running at 4K, looks beautiful. Moving over to 3D games, Counter-Strike with low settings is getting upwards of 140 frames per second. And I sound like a broken record, but this is the best performance I've seen on a mini PC by far, to the point where I would actually recommend this for competitive shooters. Moving over to Halo 4, this one can run at original settings 1080p, 60 frames per second. Every other PC I've tested has required performance settings, so this is an entirely different league here. And Street Fighter V running at medium settings, 1080p, 60Hz, completely solid, no hiccups at all. So obviously at this point, all of your low-end and medium setting games, they're going to run just fine. So let's kick it up a notch and try some AAA titles. We'll start with Forza Horizon 5. Now, first thing I did is run the performance test, which they have inside the game here, which is going to basically auto-load an intensive race and see what your benchmarks are going to look like. And as you can see here, under low settings, they expect to get at least 37 frames per second. But in real life settings, when I just turn on the game and start playing, I kept it at low settings and I was getting upwards of 55 frames per second. Every once in a while it would dip under 50, but it was getting nowhere near 30, so you're going to have a nice smooth experience with Forza Horizon 5 regardless. Now moving forward, here's Sea of Thieves. This is running at 720p by default, and I'm getting a solid 60 frames per second. And so I decided to go into the settings and bump up the resolution to 1080p just to get some prettier graphics. And as you can see here under default settings, it's stable at 30 frames per second, but if I had to choose between the two, I didn't see a lot of difference between 1080p and 720p, but the difference between 30 and 60 frames was much more apparent. And so personally, I would prefer to use the 720p settings and then get that frame rate closer to 60 Hz instead. For me, I think the cartoony look of Sea of Thieves looks just fine at 720p. So let's try AAA shooters. We're going to start with Halo Infinite, and unfortunately, computer says no. The game won't even allow you to boot with its current onboard graphics. So let's take a step back and test Doom Eternal instead. Now in booting it up, it did give a warning that the drivers are not supported, and so for that reason I turned it on the very lowest settings that I could find in the menu. So resolution of 576p, and then everything else set to the lowest quality. And unfortunately, not only does the game not look so great, but it plays terribly. There was a bunch of stutters and things like that. And so I would consider Doom Eternal to be unplayable on this PC. And hopefully we'll get some drivers down the line that will improve the experience, but for now, this is a little bit disappointing with AAA shooters. So now let's move over to game emulation. I'm not even going to test the lower end stuff, we're going to jump right into GameCube. And so I'm going to keep everything to 3x resolution or 1080p, and as you can see here, GameCube is absolutely no problem at all. So games like Mario Kart, Metroid Prime, Bloody Roar, they're all going to run no problem, not a hint of stuttering or slowdown, you just have a solid 60 frames per second. And Need for Speed Most Wanted was relatively good. I would get a dip every once in a while down to something like 55 frames per second, but as a whole completely playable. And same thing with F-Zero GX. For the most part, it would run at 60 frames per second, but I would get some dips here and there as well as some audio crackling. But I would say still overall this is completely playable at 1080p. And the exact same story for Nintendo Wii, running at 1080p upscaled here. I'm getting 60 frames per second, no problem with Mario Kart Wii. And even Tatsunoko vs Capcom here at 1080p worked just great. I would get some stutters every once in a while when introducing a new graphical move, but other than that, everything worked well. So along those same lines, let's try emulating Wii U. We're also going to upscale this to 1080p. And as you can see here, Super Mario 3D World is working just fine. Now for the most part, Wii U games played at a native 720p resolution, and so an upscale to 1080p isn't a huge stretch, but all the same, it's really nice to see this fluid and smooth gameplay at 1080p for both Mario 3D World as well as Mario Kart 8. Now, Wind Waker HD did play at 1080p natively, but does run at 30 frames per second. All the same, it still runs wonderfully and looks beautiful. I'm using a contrast shader here just to give it a little bit more pop, and man, it looks great. The only Wii U game that I kept at 720p is Breath of the Wild, and that's for obvious reasons. This is a very hard game to emulate. But even at 720p, I was getting well over 30 frames per second. For the most part, I was actually closer to 55 frames per second the whole time. And so I would say in terms of emulating Breath of the Wild, even with a shader applied here, this is a very capable system for that. And so yeah, in terms of a Nintendo emulation all the way up through Wii U, I'm more than happy. Let's move over to PlayStation for a moment. So here is PS2 running Soul Calibur 3. I'm doing 3x resolution, so 1080p here as well. And I would get some dips every once in a while, but for the most part, Soul Calibur 3 was just fine. Same thing with Tekken 5, 3x resolution here. It's running at a stable 60 frames per second. Now, unfortunately, God of War 2 did have some slowdown here. It would drop down to something like 50 frames per second at 1080p. And so obviously that's less than ideal running at 3x resolution. But if you bump that down to a 2x resolution 720p, you are going to get stable 60 frames per second. And honestly, even at 720p resolution, this game still looks pretty dang good. And so I would say that PS2 is completely playable on this box as well. Okay, moving over to the original Xbox, we're going to use the ZEMU emulator and a 2x resolution, and as you can see, it's running well. The most obvious drawback here is some screen tearing near the middle of the screen, and that screen tearing seems to be pretty common for me when I'm testing the ZEMU using onboard graphics. And so it's going to be up to you whether or not you find that acceptable. Some games are going to run better at a 1x resolution. For example, Jet Set Radio Future didn't do very well at 2x resolution, but 1x was fine. The only game I found to be unplayable was Soul Calibur 2. Even running at a 1x resolution, this had quite a bit of slowdown. So if anything, I would say Xbox emulation on the TH50 is a mixed bag. Let's step it up now to PS3 gameplay. Now, I don't have a ton of PS3 games to test. The file size on these is just enormous. But all the same, with a mid-range game like Prince of Persia here, it is running at a pretty stable 30 frames per second. I would get some dips here and there with under 30 frames per second, so that's not ideal. And I did have this weird glowing effect with this game in particular, and I wasn't able to figure that out in the settings, but maybe this is something that could be fixed. Now, more graphically intensive games, things like Infamous, unfortunately don't play very well. Now, the emulator tries really hard to give you a smooth gameplay experience, but the thing is, the frame rate goes between 15 and 30 frames per second. And to me, this is way too unstable. I would consider this game to be unplayable. So unfortunately, I would say that PS3 is the upper limit for this mini PC. And finally, let's take a look at Nintendo Switch emulation. Now, I'm just going to run this at the native resolution here, and I am getting relatively smooth gameplay. The frame rate will dip below 60 frames per second on some of the more intensive games like Mario Odyssey, but all the same, it stays above 30, so it's not like there's any actual stuttering, it just makes it a little bit less smooth during certain parts. So overall, I would say this game is completely playable. Moving over here is Link's Awakening, also running at a native resolution, and same story here, so it would run over 30 frames per second, no problem. A little bit of stuttering every time I was caching a new shader, but other than that, it was running very smoothly. I would consider Nintendo Switch to be completely playable on this device. So that's really it for Windows emulation. Let's move over to Linux now. As always, I'm going to plug in my Batocera flash drive, and then I'm going to go into the recovery options here, and then boot from that partition. And that's going to boot up Batocera just like this. And I have a whole video about setting up a Batocera flash drive. I'll leave it in the video description. And so I'm not going to get too far into the weeds about this other than just to show some gameplay testing. And the thing I love about using Batocera for my emulation is that I can put everything all in one place. So things like Nintendo games obviously are going to play just fine. Same thing with Super Nintendo, no problem here. So I'm not going to dwell on this stuff. Let's move on to some of the harder things. And stepping things up here, arcade emulation is just great on this as well. I do think this device is a little bit overpowered if you were going to use it for an arcade emulator. I think this can do a lot more than that. But all the same, it's going to run through games like Killer Instinct or Tekken 2, no problem. So if you wanted to have a really nice PC in your arcade cabinet, this would be an option too. But personally, I think it's a better fit for a desktop computer. Moving along, here is the standalone DuckStation emulator running PlayStation 1. I'm running this at a 5x resolution, so 1080p, and I've also turned on geometry correction to help with some of those wobbly pixels. And as you can see here, this is all running just perfectly. Now moving along, here is Nintendo 64 running at a 1080p upscale within RetroArch. And as you can see, absolutely no problems here. Even if I try GoldenEye 007 running at 1080p, it still runs at a stable 60 frames per second. So let's keep going. Here is Sega Saturn using RetroArch with the Yabasan Shiro core, also upscaled to 1080p. And just like with the other systems, this is running at a stable 60 frames per second, no problem. So when it comes to Sega Saturn, even when it's upscaled, this is great. Same story with Sega Dreamcast, we're going to use the Flycast core within RetroArch, and like with the others, 1080p is no problem. And finally, the last of the emulators from this general tier, let's try out Sony PSP. Now this I'm going to run at a 4x resolution, so 1080p again, and as you can see with Outrun 2006, no problem at all. Of course, the easier to run games like Virtua Tennis, they're going to run no problem as well, but I was surprised to find that 4x resolution 1080p with God of War also worked at full speed. Now this is the exact same performance if I tried to emulate on the Windows side. The biggest benefit here of using Batocera is that I can have all of my emulation and games all in one place, and of course in this case it's all hosted on one flash drive. Okay, let's move over to GameCube and see how this runs. Again, I'm upscaling this to a 3x or a 1080p resolution, and as you can see here with Wave Race Blue Storm, it is running at a stable 30 frames per second, which is what this game originally ran at. But yeah, across the board, the GameCube emulation was a little bit worse than it was on the Windows side, but all the same, most games are going to play just fine. In fact, the only game that I had any sort of issues with was, of course, F-Zero GX. This game is so hard to emulate. And like with on the Windows side, I would get relatively stable 60 frames per second during most parts of the course, but there would be parts where I would get some significant slowdown, and the slowdown on the Batocera side was a little bit worse than it was on the Windows side. Moving over to PS2, this one was a little bit worse than on the Windows side, so I kept it at 720p across the board, but as you can see, some of those easier to emulate games, things like Simpsons Hit and Run, no problem. And I would also say those middle range games, things like Grand Theft Auto 3, those played pretty well too. 60 frames per second was relatively stable. Unfortunately, moving over to God of War 2, even at 720p, which ran really great on the Windows side, completely struggled with Batocera. And that's kind of unfortunate, but that's how it goes. Ratchet & Clank also struggled to get anywhere near 60 frames per second, and it also had a bunch of graphical anomalies, which is kind of common with the Batocera version of PS2. So moving over to original Xbox emulation on Batocera, this is running at a native 1x resolution, and unfortunately the performance on this was hit and miss, and more miss than hit. For example, Fable seemed to run at a pretty good frame rate, but it did have some weird blooming at the top and the left, and games like Jade Empire just wouldn't really run at all. Soul Calibur 2 does better on Batocera than it did on Windows, but the screen tearing is pretty bad on this one. I would say this is unplayable. But you never know, some games do work just fine. For example, Lord of the Rings Return of the King, this one was pretty good. So in general, I would recommend just testing out Xbox games and seeing which ones work. But all the same, I'm pretty confident in saying don't buy a mini PC like this if you only want to emulate original Xbox. In terms of Wii U, everything worked really well, but I did have to keep everything at a native resolution, so I wasn't upscaling to 1080p. But all the same games did play well, and as you can see with Bayonetta 2 here, even the more graphically challenging games still ran at a relatively stable frame rate. So yeah, overall I would say that Batocera works well on this mini PC, and so if you want to have just one place to put all of your ROMs and emulators, this is a great option. Okay, we've been talking about this guy for a while now. This is actually my longest mini PC review ever at this point. So let's start wrapping things up. I'm going to talk about what I like and what I don't like about the TH50. As always, we're going to start with what I like. So when it comes down to PC gaming and emulation, I think this thing does really well for the price. I would say you can play 95% of PC games with no problem, provided you go in and maybe change the settings to something a little bit lower depending on the game. And when it comes to emulation on the Windows side, I would say you can play up to Nintendo Switch with relatively minor issues, but PS3 is probably going to be your upper limit. Now another thing I like about the mini PC is that the fan noise is minimal, and when it does kick on, it's downright pleasant. It sounds more like a traditional desktop PC than a mini one. And thanks to the thermals, the fan doesn't come on that often. And I really appreciate that it has 2 different SATA drive slots. An additional M.2 would be even better, but no complaints here. Overall, this is the first mini PC that I can wholeheartedly recommend as a well-rounded PC. As we demonstrated in the video here, it can do gaming really well, but I think it would be capable for video editing, photo editing, and then of course your everyday PC use too. Okay, let's talk about what I don't like about the TH50, and the list here is relatively short. Number 1, I don't like that the RAM is not upgradable. I do think that 16GB is going to be plenty for most use cases, but it is unfortunate that you can upgrade it if you do want to. And finally, when it comes to emulation, the Batocera performance is not as great as it is on Windows. And so while I'd love to say that this is an excellent Batocera machine, the truth is you're going to get better performance running emulators via Windows. So yeah, overall, I'm really impressed with the TH50. As you can see, it's a little banged up, and that's because I've been running this thing for the past few weeks and loving it. Now, I've reviewed quite a few mini PCs over the past few months. Most of them have been from the company Beelink. And they've been of varying prices and performance, and I would say that up until this video, the GTI 11 at $650 was the best one I had tested. But despite being $50 cheaper than the GTI 11, I would say the TH50 is head and shoulders above the GTI 11. This is the best mini PC I've found at this price range by far. And so if you're in the market for a mid-range PC, and you can't be bothered with getting one of those pre-built towers that you would get from a big box store, or dealing with today's current GPU prices, and maybe you're a little bit wary of building your own or putting together a used PC, then I would say the TH50 is a great solution. But let me know what you think in the comments below. What do you think of the design? Do you think the performance is worth the price? As always, thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.